The air in the grand lecture hall of the Thousand Worlds Academy was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the faint, sweet musk of a dozen different species. For young Xylos, a student from the silicon-based race of the Lyrians, it was a scent of crushing boredom. He sat in his translucent chair, his crystalline body absorbing the ambient light. As Professor Zylak droned on about the universal principles of survival, life in its most basic form is a fragile thing. The professor's resonant voice boomed from the podium. Zylak, a towering six-limbed being with skin like polished stone, was known for his dramatic flair. It is a delicate balance of chemical reactions, a fragile dance on the edge of the void, and this balance can be shattered by the slightest imbalance. A simple hydrocarbon chain, an unexpected protein, a trace of an alien enzyme. Any of these can be the final touch that sends a being into the silence of non-existence. Xylos sighed, his internal clock counting the minutes until the lecture was over. He had been through this. Every student at the academy knew the universal toxin index by heart. They all understood that the universe was a minefield of potential poisons. From the corrosive mists of the Xylos 17 moons to the lethal bioluminescent spores of the Gethia system, this was common knowledge, a foundation of galactic education. So what was the point of repeating it? Then, Professor Zylak's third primary eye swiveled and locked onto the back of the lecture hall. All the students followed his gaze to the single human in the class. Her name was Elara, and she was the only representative from the newly discovered, highly primitive planet known as Earth. She was a curiosity, a biological anomaly, and a source of constant pity for her fellow students. Her skin was soft, her limbs were spindly, and she possessed no natural defenses. She was, to put it mildly, an evolutionary dead end in the making. Professor Zylak's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, his stone-like fingers pointing directly at her. Today we shall discuss the most paradoxical form of survival. We shall discuss a species that, by all known biological metrics, should have perished from their own home world centuries ago. A species that not only tolerates poisons, but actively consumes them. I speak, of course, of the Terrans. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Some students shifted nervously in their seats, their biological alarm systems flaring at the very idea. Elara, however, simply offered a small, knowing smile. She had heard this before. She had seen the way aliens reacted to the simple truths of her home. The professor continued, his voice regaining its booming, authoritative tone. Their biology is an affront to logic. Take for example the concept of capsaicin. It is a neurotoxin found in certain Terran plants, designed to repel herbivores. For most species, even a minuscule exposure would cause extreme cellular damage, inflammation, and a rapid shutdown of the nervous system. The Terrans, however, call this substance spicy. They deliberately add it to their food, and some even compete to see. A low murmur rippled through the lecture hall, a sound not of boredom, but of pure, unadulterated shock. The students' multifaceted eyes were fixed on Elara. For them, the idea of a species willingly ingesting toxic substances for pleasure was not just bizarre, it was a violation of the most fundamental laws of biology. Xylos's own light-sensitive photoreceptors were still flashing in protest from the faint, distant scent of the chili pepper. Professor Zylak, with a look of stern satisfaction, allowed the whispers to die down before he continued. Such claims, of course, are difficult to believe without direct observation. This is why we have a volunteer from the Terran species to demonstrate this anomaly. His gesture toward Elara was almost a challenge. Terran 734B, as our records designate her, will now provide a live demonstration of what they call spicy. Elara's smile widened, a gesture her classmates still struggled to interpret. Was it a sign of distress, a threat? No, it seemed to be one of pure amusement. She stood up from her seat and walked down the aisle with an easy gait, ignoring the cautious, almost fearful glances of the other students. She moved with a confidence that seemed out of place for a being so physically frail. Professor Zylak placed a new sealed container on the desk. It was no simple dried pepper, but a small vial of viscous liquid, a fiery red and orange blend that shimmered in the ambient light. A warning label, in multiple galactic languages, flashed a crimson danger, biohazard symbol. This, the professor announced, his voice now a low, serious rumble, is a concentrated extract of a Terran pepper. It is approximately 1 million times more potent than its raw form. A single drop, if it were to touch the epidermis of a TCI, would cause a third-degree chemical burn. Ingested, it would destroy the esophageal and gastrointestinal lining of a Nagathian in moments. The students recoiled in unison. a wave of collective horror washing over them. Alara, in stark contrast, simply tilted her head. "Oh, that looks like some good hot sauce," she said with a casual lilt to her voice, as if she were commenting on the weather. Her utter nonchalance in the face of such a terrifying substance was almost more unsettling than the substance itself. Professor Zylak carefully unsealed the vial, holding it with a pair of long metallic forceps. He offered it to Alara, who took it without hesitation. She lifted the small vial to her lips and, with a confident, deliberate movement, took a small sip. Every alien in the class held their breath. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, Ilara's face contorted. Her eyes squeezed shut, her cheeks flushed a bright red, and a single tear began to stream from the corner of her eye. She coughed once, a deep, raspy sound, and her hand instinctively flew to her throat. The students braced themselves for her collapse, their medical monitors screaming internal warnings. This was it. The human would now pay the price for their biological arrogance. But instead of falling, Alara simply let out a long, shuddering breath. The redness in her cheeks, the stunned silence of the lecture hall was broken only by the soft, biological hum of the life support systems. No one moved. They watched Alara, who was now fanning her face with a hand, a faint, almost imperceptible sheen of sweat on her brow. She was not dying. She was not even in distress. To their utterly logical, fragile biologies, this was a paradox of the highest order. Professor Zylak adjusted his stance on the podium, his stone-like body exuding a newfound gravitas. As you can see, the Terran species operates under an entirely different set of biological rules. He pointed a finger at the still gleaming residue of the hot sauce vial. For us, a substance like capsaicin is a it binds to the pain receptors, but also to a range of other systems, initiating a cascade of cellular death and organ failure. For the Terrans, however, this chemical only binds to the pain receptors in their oral cavities and throat. It creates a sensation they call burning, but crucially, it does not trigger a systemic fatal response. Xylos's mind reeled. It was like learning that fire, to some creatures, was a source of light and warmth, not just a destructive force. But what truly baffled him was the next revelation. More than that, the professor continued, their brains, in response to this deliberate pain, release a flood of endorphins. This chemical, for the Terran, creates a feeling of intense pleasure and euphoria. They have, in essence, trained themselves to enjoy the very feeling of being poisoned. Zylak looked at the class, his eyes scanning each student's bewildered face. Their consumption of toxins is not an accident of evolution. It is a deliberate, cultural act. They are addicted to pain. A student from the winged race of the Aryans, whose species could detect the slightest atmospheric impurity, shivered visibly. That's a sickness, she whispered, her voice filled with a revulsion that Xylos shared. Perhaps, Professor Zylak said, but from a survival standpoint, it is a formidable advantage. The Terrans have developed an incredible tolerance to substances that would incapacitate entire armies of other species. Think of their stimulants. Their most common beverages, which they consume by the billions, are made from substances that are powerful alkaloids and neurotoxins for us. Caffeine and nicotine, these are compounds that would send a Gethia into a fatal cigar or cause Illyrian-S crystalline structure to shatter. Yet, for a Terran, they are the simple necessities of their morning ritual. Xylos glanced at Alara again. She had returned to her seat, a faint smile still on her face. Her casualness in the face of such a terrifying biological reality was unnerving. He no longer saw her as a fragile, pathetic creature. The students of the Thousand Worlds Academy were still reeling from the revelations of the last lesson. The concept of spicy had been a shock to their systems, but the idea that a species could be addicted to pain, that they found pleasure in their own biological distress, was a terrifying new reality. Professor Zylak, seemingly energized by their revulsion, now held up the next object of study. It was a clear glass bottle filled with a dark amber liquid. A Terran label with intricate, stylized lettering was affixed to its side. A faint, almost sickly sweet aroma wafted from the sealed container, causing a few of the more sensitive students to instinctively recoil. This, my students, Professor Zylak announced, is something the Terrans call a spirit. Its primary chemical component is ethanol, a potent and flammable universal solvent. A single milliliter of this substance, if ingested by most known life forms, would cause immediate neurological shutdown and catastrophic organ failure. Xylos felt his crystalline form grow cold. He had seen the analysis of ethanol in his chemistry classes. It was a substance used to sterilize surgical tools and as a component in rocket fuel. The idea of consuming it was incomprehensible. He glanced at Ilara, whose eyes were fixed on the bottle with a look of warm nostalgia. And yet, the professor continued, Terrans consume this for what they describe as social purposes. They hold rituals where groups of them will ingest varying quantities of this poison. They call the resulting state of altered consciousness drunkenness. A student from the symbiotic Kytha race, whose two halves communicated via telepathic whispers, now spoke aloud, her voice wavering. But why? What purpose does this altered state serve? Does it enhance their hunting skills? Does it improve their cognitive abilities? Professor Zylak let out a sound that was the closest an alien could get to a chuckle. Quite the opposite. Terran records indicate that in this state, their cognitive functions are significantly impaired. Their speech becomes slurred, their motor skills degrade, and their ability to think logically is severely compromised. They become, for a time, less efficient, less capable versions of themselves. Ilara, now unable to contain herself, raised her hand. It's not like that, she said, her voice soft but earnest. It's about letting go. You get to laugh more easily. You talk to people you normally wouldn't. You sing songs you forgot you knew. It's about being together without all the usual seriousness. It's fun. The lecture hall was silent once again, but this time with a different kind of confusion. To a race that valued efficiency and logical thought above all else, the idea of intentionally hindering oneself for fun was utterly foreign. Their every action was tied to survival, to the optimization of their fragile existence. They had no concept of self-sabotage for the sake of emotional bonding. Xylos, the students of the Thousand Worlds Academy, were still processing the idea of self-inflicted cognitive impairment for fun. The concept of drunkenness had shaken their understanding of logical behavior to its core. But Professor Zylak was not finished. He brought up a holographic screen, and a new image flickered to life. It showed a small, unassuming Terran male clinging to the sheer vertical face of a massive rock cliff. He had no ropes, no harnesses, no safety equipment of any kind. Below him, thousands of meters of open air stretched out, leading to a jagged, rocky ground. The silence in the lecture hall was absolute. Every alien student's biological senses screamed in protest at the image, a wave of collective vertigo and terror sweeping through them. Terrans call this free solo climbing. The professor's voice resonated with a new, almost somber tone. It is an act of recreation. Xylos felt his crystalline body grow cold and still. Recreation, he had no word for this. His people, the Lyrians, were methodical and cautious, their existence a calculated balance of risk and reward. They built vast, intricate structures and lived for millennia, avoiding any action that could jeopardize their physical forms. What he was seeing was a suicide attempt, a biological anomaly with an unexplainable urge for self-destruction. The holographic screen changed, showing other examples. A Terran strapped to a glider, leaping from a cliff face, their body twisting and turning in the currents of a violent storm. Another, on a small fibrous board, rode the crest of a liquid tidal wave that towered over him, a cataclysmic force of nature. Yet another launched himself from an aircraft in mid-flight, tumbling through the atmosphere with no visible means of control. They have given this a name, a term to describe the pleasure derived from such self-endangerment, Professor Zylak explained. They call it adrenaline. It is a chemical that floods their systems in moments of extreme peril, and they seek it out, consuming it as eagerly as they would their spicy foods or their spirits. Ilara, who had been watching the display with a wistful expression, offered her own, disarming explanation. It's about the feeling of being alive, she said, her voice soft. When you're up there, on the edge, every part of you is focused. You're not thinking about your job or your worries. It's just you and the moment. You're in control of the one thing that truly matters, your own life. The students simply stared at her, their minds struggling to comprehend. What kind of species seeks out the feeling of being on the brink of death just to feel alive? Why would they choose to live on a razor's edge? The lecture hall was silent, but this time, it was a silence of profound contemplation. The students of the Thousand Worlds Academy had just been introduced to the terrifying concept of recreation, the human desire to court death for the sake of feeling alive. Professor Zylak, however, knew that the most baffling part of the lesson was yet to come. We have discussed their tolerance for poison, their addiction to pain, and their reckless disregard for personal safety, the professor said, his voice now a low, solemn rumble. But all of these are merely symptoms of the Terran species' true, most terrifying paradox, their capacity for both immense cruelty and unimaginable kindness. He brought up a new holographic image. It showed a desolate, war-torn landscape, pocked with craters and littered with the broken husks of Terran vehicles. The image was grainy, but the horror was clear. Terran beings had inflicted this devastation upon other Terran beings. We have seen other species engage in conflict, Zylak explained, but never with the scale and ferocity that the Terrans do upon their own kind. They are the only species known to systematically and ritualistically destroy their own population over abstract concepts like territory or ideology. The students watched, their bioscanners screaming in revulsion. This was not a fight for survival. This was a form of self-immolation, a calculated act of mutual destruction. The sheer illogical nature of it was horrifying. A student from the hive-minded pylons recoiled, his antennae quivering in disbelief. The very idea of one part of a species harming another was a biological impossibility for them. Then Professor Zylak changed the image. A new scene flickered to life. A human, dressed in a white smock, knelt by the side of an alien lifeform. The Terran's hands were gentle, and a look of profound empathy was etched on their face as they tended to the alien's wounds. This was followed by a montage. Terrans building shelters for refugees, Terrans sharing their food with the starving, Terrans risking their own lives to save strangers from a collapsing building. This, the professor announced, his voice filled with a new, weary awe, is the same species, capable of building hospitals and waging genocidal wars, capable of both immense savagery and a deep, self-sacrificing compassion that defies all logic. They are driven not by survival, not by logic, but by a chaotic, powerful and utterly unpredictable force they call emotion. Elara, who had remained silent throughout the final part of the lecture, now spoke. "It's the same thing, in a way," she said, her voice soft. "The love we have for something can make us do anything to protect it. It's the reason we fight wars, but it's also the reason we build hospitals. It's why we take risks for ourselves, and why we die to save a stranger."